Welcome everybody to another episode of History here. So I was scrolling online and I was looking at some news regarding international politics and particularly regarding the Prime Minister of the UK, Starmer, that I found this article on The Telegraph titled Starmer told to guarantee no other British overseas territories will be signed away. So what is this in regard? So what recently happened is that they were talking about they written to the Foreign Office to ask officials to confirm that there were plans that the UK handed the Chagos Island to Mauritius. So the Chagos Island was British owned from 1814, but was handed away by the government in a deal that he claimed would safeguard global security by ending a long-running dispute. The islands include Diego Garcia, which hosts a strategically important US-UK military base, and the Prime Minister was asked to guarantee that under Labour, no other British overseas territories would be signed away. And this was one assurance that the Prime Minister told. And they said that Chagos does not change our policy or approach to other overseas territories. So the Chagos deal is unique and is not going anywhere. However, what I've heard is that given this small territorial dispute where Chagos returns to Mauritius after being under the UK's control for a couple of centuries, actually, even more than 200 years, I think. So Argentina, under President Milei, has reiterated its claim to sovereignty, promising a roadmap towards regaining control of the Falkland Island. Yes, the disputed Falklands. The stand was emphasized following the UK's deal with Mauritius over the Chagos archipelago, which Argentina sees as a precedent for resolving sovereignty disputes. The UK has consistently reaffirmed its commitment to the Falkland Islands, emphasizing the principle of self-determination. Despite the Chagos deal, UK officials, including Foreign Secretary David Cameron, have made it clear that the Falkland situation is unique and there is no intention to negotiate sovereignty against the will of the islanders. And by reading these articles and these small pieces here, Argentina views the Chagos Agreement as a model for resolving colonial disputes. The UK and the Falkland Islands government have differentiated their case, pointing to distinct historical and demographic context. So I wanted to go back and study the situation of the Falklands Island and what happened in the far year of 1982 when it was a different world and where the geopolitics of the world, where all the major powers during that time were reshaping foreign policy and territories around the world, and something really unique happened that most of you do not know. And I really wanted to go on and cover this important event because I got the idea from these recent articles. So I just wanted to go deep into the Falklands War and check what really happened. So the Falklands War was unique because it was kind of a major conflict between major capitalist Western nations that were allied with the United States since 1945. So this was one of the sole wars that was fought between Western countries, the UK and Argentina, making a significant moment in modern history. And this was set into a broader geopolitical landscape. And this highlights how Even nations that had shared alliances and interests can experience conflict when tensions escalate. And this conflict serves as a reminder that the alignment with on the global stage does not always guarantee harmony between countries. But also, there's another significant factor that we need to consider regarding the Falklands War, because it was a war between the UK and Argentina. It was a conflict between England and Argentina in 1982. And now, over 4 decades later, it remains a pivotal moment in history. In the United Kingdom, laws dictate that documents become public after 30 years, leading to the declassification of records relating to this conflict. While some sensitive documents may still be kept under wraps, about 6 years ago, the British government released a wealth of classified information. And the Margaret Thatcher Foundation hosts an extensive collection of these documents on its website, offering like a valuable insight into this era. And there's a treasure trove of transcripts and phone calls with President Reagan, notes and comments on telegrams, and minutes from cabinet meetings. It's an endless array of materials, and for those of you who are interested in understanding the details of historical events, this is it, and it's still open. If you go on a website of Margaret Thatcher Foundation, you can find all these documents. So I would be curious to know what was discussed in confidential ministerial meetings, not only with leaders like Trump or Putin, but perhaps even with figures like modern figures, like Vice President Kamala Harris at this point. And maybe in 30 years, we may have access to some private discussion, also President Biden, However, we already have access to the conversations from 1982, which is one of the main reasons why I wanted to explore the events surrounding the Falklands War. Now, when it comes to naming this conflict, it's a little bit tricky because the choice can feel weighted, because if we refer to them as the Falklands War, where we kind of inherently take a side, because the British called them Falklands, while the Argentinians refer to them as the Las Islas Malvinas. By choosing one name over the other, you imply a certain perspective. Officially, the islands were known as the Falklands during the war, and they still are today, and in this context, we'll be using the term Falklands War. Now, to understand how the Falklands War broke out, it's crucial to know what the Falklands are, something that many in Britain were largely unaware of at the time. According to journalists from that period, most of the British public believed the Falklands were mere islands off the coast of Scotland. In reality, the Falklands comprise a significant archipelago about half the size of Sicily. They're situated in a remote South Atlantic Ocean toward Antarctica. Now, the word itself, archipelago, for me, in Italian, the word is archipelago. So every time it makes me want to say archipelago, but it's archipelago because there's that CH. Now, the islands lie approximately 5,100 kilometers from the Argentine coast. I don't think that's that far, Let's check one moment quick, because 5,000, I'm pretty sure. How far are the Falklands from Argentina? 1,521 kilometers. So there is a big difference there. And maybe that's a number from England. From England is 7,947 miles. Yes, that is far. So 1,500 kilometers. Wow, that's very far. And so they're that far away from the Argentine coast, and they are home to a population of English and Scottish descent who speak English and hold British citizenship. This arrangement has been in place for 191 years. The British took possession of the Falklands in 1833, making 1983 a notable year. It was marked as the 150th anniversary of the British presence there. Now, such anniversaries often spark serious discussion and reflections, making this particular moment very significant. In Argentina, the impending 150th anniversary of the British occupation of the Malvinas was a weighty topic of discussion, contrasting sharply with perceptions in England. While many in England thought the Falklands are a small Scottish island similar to the Orkneys or Shetlands, in Argentina this anniversary loomed large in the national consciousness. The Malvinas have taken on a near mythical status in Argentina. For generations, Argentine children have been taught that the cruel imperialist British colonizers seized the islands, that one day they must return them to their rightful place, Las Malvinas Argentinas. This narrative was deeply influenced by Argentine perspective on the islands and fueled by the desire to reclaim them, making this topic deeply ingrained in the national consciousness. Now, let me explain a similar scenario back in World War I. The situation is suggestive to the Italian sentiment surrounding the territories of Trento and Trieste. You try to say Trento and Trieste with your American accent. I really challenge you to say that. And then once you say that, try to say tigre contro tigre. And then you tell me how you can do that. Tiger against tiger. You know, it's very funny. Tongue twisters. Scioglilingua. So during World War I, so what happened, there was although even there is a crucial difference with the Falklands, but something that I wanted to mention quick. The inhabitants of Trento and Trieste were genuinely Italian, while the people of the Falklands are predominantly English. But Trento and Trieste are two cities, would say, in the northeastern part of Italy with a complex history, especially during and after World War I. Both cities were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before the war. After World War I, the Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1919 resulted in Italy acquiring these territories, which were mostly inhabited by Italian speakers. This annexation was significant for Italy as it aimed to unify all Italian-speaking peoples under one nation. However, the transition was not without conflict and resentment, particularly among the non-Italian populations who felt marginalized. The cities became symbols of national pride for Italy, just as the Malvinas are for Argentina. Claims to these territories are deeply connected to national identity and historical grievances. Just as Argentine children are taught about the Malvinas, Italian children learn about the importance of Trento and Trieste in the context of Italy's national unification and identity. Nevertheless, it's fundamentally about territorial claims. Just as the 150th anniversary of British occupation approached, Argentina's leaders felt compelled to act, and it's now known that the decision to invade was made in the December of 1981. During this period, Argentina was under military rule, known as the dictatorship of the generals. This regime is famous for being one of the bloodiest dictatorships of the 20th century, particularly due to the Dirty War. This term describes the brutal campaign waged against those perceived as threats, including communists, terrorists, and leftists. The military junta, Junta in Spanish, committed numerous human rights abuses, leading to the enforced disappearance of tens of thousands of people. And this is the legacy of, I don't know if you ever heard of it, the desaparecidos, which still sparks debate and reflection in Argentina. A junta is the term used to describe a group of military leaders who seize control of a government, typically through a coup or other non-democratic means. It is often associated with authoritarian regimes where a small group of military officers or high-ranking officials rules the country, usually suspending civilian rule or democratic processes. By December 1981, the military junta found itself at a critical juncture. The situation in Argentina was catastrophic, and the regime's popularity had plummeted. The economic crisis was severe, with inflation soaring to 600% and widespread poverty affecting citizens. Despite the oppressive regime, unions were protesting daily, although each demonstration was met with violent repression from the police. Adding to this turmoil was the growing political crisis. The issue of the desaparecidos was becoming more prominent, with the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, who later became known as the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, gathering every Thursday outside the Casa Rosada, the presidential palace in Buenos Aires. These were people who demanded answers for their missing children. These gatherings were also suppressed by police, but mothers returned each week, determined to keep their cause alive. In this state of turmoil, the military junta is unstable and unsure of its next step. At the end of 1981, in a surprising turn of events, the junta stages a coup against itself. General Viola, the dictator in power until that point, is deposed by another general, Leopoldo Galtieri, a very Italian name, who gains the support of most military officials. On December 22, 1981, Galtieri seizes control, declaring himself president for life with sweeping powers, including the authority to appoint his successor. So it's a very imperial, authoritarian political structure, as you can see. So who is Galtieri, General Galtieri? A brief profile reveals that, like many Argentinians, he's the son of impoverished Italian immigrants. I told you. It's important to note that Argentina has a significant Italian heritage, with about half of its population having at least one Italian ancestor. Galtieri is a military officer of Italian descent who has built a career within the armed forces. A pivotal moment in his military journey occurred in 1949. As a young lieutenant, he was selected to attend a special course in Panama. This program was run by the United States Army, which was designed for officers from South American militaries and is known as the School of the Americas. The School of the Americas, located in Panama, trains young officers from various South American armies, including those from Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Peru, and Colombia, under the guidance of American instructors. The focus of their training is not primarily on traditional warfare, but rather on repression and counterinsurgency tactics. Many notorious dictators, as their collaborators from South America, have attended the school, including Lieutenant Leopoldo Galtieri of the Argentine Army. Here's an interesting fact. When Galtieri passed away about a decade ago, the English newspaper, actually it would be more than a decade ago, the English newspaper, The Economist, published a scathing obituary in which they claimed that Galtieri was, to the best of their knowledge, the only officer in history to have flunked out of the School of the Americas for South American officers. So he probably was not successful. But we must emphasize that the claim about Galtieri flunking out of the School of the Americas is based on a rumor from The Economist, and its veracity has not been confirmed. We don't know. Regardless, Galtieri continued to advance in his military career. Would he advance in his military career if he didn't pass the school? We don't know. Eventually, he became one of the prominent figures in the Argentine military junta. By December 1981, he declared himself president for life. Just 10 months earlier, he had been warmly received by President Ronald Reagan in the United States, where they exchanged friendly greetings. The U.S. had a supporting relationship with Argentina, largely because the country adopted a staunch anti-communist stance and violently suppressed leftist opposition. During that time, you might understand that the world was anti-communist, at least the Western world. For those who might find a sense of déjà vu, it's reminiscent of historical events, such as when Lord Halifax, the British foreign minister, visited Berlin in 1937 and praised Hitler's regime as a protector of the old order. Well, we're not trying to make associations between any particular character, just the gesture. Similar narratives seem to repeat themselves. When General Galtieri visited Washington, he was met with enthusiasm, and there were various proclamations praising him as a great leader, a sentiment echoed by one of Reagan's advisors, who referred to him as a magnificent general. In December 1981, the so-called magnificent general orchestrated a coup, seizing power in Argentina, with the backing of aligned admirals and generals. They devised a bold plan to reclaim the Falklands. This pact, which solidified Galtieri's rise to power, outlined their intentions to occupy the islands by force in the coming months. The situation involved two significant bets. The first bet was that the Argentine people would erupt in ecstatic enthusiasm upon hearing that the Malvinas had been occupied or liberated. The military junta believed that this patriotic fervor would overshadow the pressing issues of inflation, poverty, all the social issues, the desaparecidos, and other domestic crises. Remarkably, they were close to winning this bet, as for several days following the occupation, a wave of national pride swept through Argentina. The second bet was that the world would accept the situation as a fait accompli, as a done deal, believing that the British would lack the courage to respond. The Argentine military felt confident, believing that with President Reagan as an ally, any serious repercussions from their actions would be averted. This situation would be kind of similar like when Hitler annexed Austria to Germany and nobody moved a finger. Initially, this plan was kept under wraps. No information leaked out because for years there had been prevailing sense that the issue of the Falklands or Malvinas were gradually resolving itself. For about 15 years, there had been sporadic meetings between the British and the Argentine representatives to discuss the future of the islands. But during these discussions, various agreements were reached. While the British had never placed sovereignty over the islands on the negotiation table, there was a growing belief that discussions might eventually be possible. Over time, both sides accepted forms of co-management, with Argentina making significant concessions. And to show this, during those years of cordial negotiations, Argentina guaranteed vital air and sea links to the Falklands to ensure that the islands, located 1,500 kilometers away from the Argentine coast, would be left. Actually, here, so from the mainland of Argentina, but the Argentina goes very thin, so very directly from east to west, it will be around 500 kilometers, more or less. So from the coast, they were providing support, airspace to that extent, and especially since any other locations in the world was thousands of kilometers away. There was indeed a cordial atmosphere during these discussions, and the last of these meetings took place in New York, facilitated by the United Nations, the UN, which pressured both the British and Argentinians to negotiate. The final meeting occurred in February 1982, and by the end of that month, a statement was released. Those familiar with diplomatic processes know how crucial the wording of such final press releases can be. This particular statement described the meeting as cordial and friendly. So, however, on March 2nd, 1982, the Argentine government issued a new declaration. They stated, Argentina has negotiated with Great Britain on the issue of the sovereignty of the islands with patience, loyalty, and good faith for over 15 years. This marked a turning point. The Argentinians expressed their frustration and made their demands clear. They were no longer willing to wait. They saw what we might now refer as the roadmap. Although the term wasn't in common use back in 1982, they want a specific deadline and a schedule of monthly meetings that was ultimately aimed at transferring sovereignty over the islands to Argentina. The statement concluded with a firm ultimatum. If their demands were not accepted, Argentina would terminate negotiations and freely choose the course of action that best served its interest. Diplomatic language is often very nuanced and complicated, isn't it? However, when reading between the lines, we see that the statement from March 2nd signals growing tension. The next day, March 3rd, the Argentine press goes into a frenzy, predicting an imminent break in diplomatic relations with England. Headlines in Buenos Aires call for cutting communications with the Falklands, noting that the British could do so without any issues. The newspapers suggest that the Argentine government needs to set a deadline for negotiations, and they take it a step further, declaring that England has 3 or 4 months to acknowledge Argentine sovereignty over the islands. If not, the press implies Argentina could take matters into its own hands, and the Americans would understand. The British ambassador in Buenos Aires carefully gathers all the newspaper from that morning, transcribes the headlines and articles, and sends a telegram to London. Upon receiving it, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher writes a note on her copy of the telegram. We must make contingency plans. It is March 3rd, 1982, and this news hits London like a bolt from the blue. No one was expecting such developments. The situation also highlights failures in both intelligence and diplomacy. The British Foreign Office had not anticipated any of this. As journalist of the Spiel from the King's College in London noted, the Foreign Office was filled with Arabists, experts of the Middle East, but had very few individuals who understood South America or cared about its affairs. So up to this point, I suppose the English really took it for granted that they wouldn't be challenged in that little corner of the world. Thus, the Foreign Office was focused on everything except the possibility of Argentina taking drastic action regarding the Falklands. The intelligence services, in fact, had been providing reassurance to the Prime Minister throughout March, claiming that while the Argentinians might talk a lot due to their Italian heritage, hey, they were unlikely to take any significant action. It is now documented history. Her Majesty's Intelligence Service, often associated with the iconic 007, at least it was. We don't know how the new 007 is going to be, but we like to dream in the past. Was convinced, the British, the intelligence, was convinced that the Argentinians were bluffing. Meanwhile, the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was growing increasingly anxious. For the first time in history, perhaps since Queen Elizabeth in the 1500s, it was a woman who would decide whether or not to go to war. Margaret Thatcher, who passed away in April 2013, has left a significant mark on history. Her career and legacy are pivotal as her reforms, including liberalization, the fight against trade unions, dismantling of union power, and the privatization of nationalized industry, have reshaped the world. Her policies, they made a difference at the time. Opinions vary on whether her impact should be celebrated or criticized, but there is no denying her immense relevance as a historical figure. So in that spring of 1982, Thatcher was navigating the early stages of her political career, still far from her iconic figure that she would eventually become. But at the time, England was grappling with a severe economic crisis as she faced significant challenges on multiple fronts. Thatcher had not yet confronted the powerful unions or initiated major privatization efforts or state-owned enterprises. Furthermore, the complex issue of Ireland added to the burdens of her government, added to more issues. Just months before the Falklands crisis erupted, Northern Irish prisoners of the IRA began a hunger strike, demanding better conditions and recognition as political prisoners. Bobby Sands, a prominent figure in the strike, and 9 others ultimately lost their lives in this protest. The British government response, led by Thatcher, was firm. She declared that a crime is a crime. Politics has nothing to do with it. At this point, she appeared politically vulnerable, with many predicting her defeat in the upcoming elections. Among the various challenges she faced, reports began to flood in about the sensational headlines surrounding the Falklands Islands in Buenos Aires. The newspapers were buzzing with outrage, yet the intelligence services reassured her that there was no reason to worry. So Margaret Thatcher remained steadfast, waiting for the Argentinians to make their next move as March unfolded. The tensions in the region steadily, however, they increased. It's essential to mention an important detail about this period. Close to the Falkland Islands lies another, even more desolate archipelago known as South Georgia. This cold, uninhabited territory is home only to penguins and a small platoon of British Marines. They're stationed there to maintain a weather observation station. While it may sound humorous to say South Georgia is near to the Falklands, it is indeed about 2,000 kilometers away from the nearest military forces. Nonetheless, it is the closest land in the sea in the area, and as such, both South Georgia and the Falklands are considered part of the same strategic zone. In March 1982, unusual events began to unfold on the remote islands of South Georgia. Small groups of Argentine workers, supposedly contracted for metal recovery, landed there. However, things took a provocative turn when these workers raised the Argentine flag, leaving the British Marines stationed there uncertain about how to respond. It later became clear that among these workers were actually Argentine Army commandos. A noteworthy detail about this operation is that it was led by Lieutenant Alfredo Astiz, an officer notorious for his involvement in Argentina's dirty war. Astiz is currently serving a life sentence. He was often referred as the Angel of Death and was convicted of crimes against humanity, including kidnapping and torture, at the Navy Mechanics School, a notorious torture center in Buenos Aires. In March 1982, Lieutenant Alfredo Astiz temporarily paused his work at Navy Torture Center to lead a mission to South Georgia. I'm not really sure if it's Astiz or Astiz, but I go with Astiz. This mission was part of Argentina's effort during the escalating tensions of the Falkland Islands. Astiz was notorious for his involvement in human rights abuses and had been sentenced for life imprisonment in absentia by France for his role in the deaths of 2 French nuns. Years later, in 2017, so Argentina also sentenced him for life imprisonment for his crimes, as we already mentioned. Back in London, officials were trying to understand Argentina's intentions. The intelligence services expressed concerns but assured the government that there was no immediate threat from the Argentinians before they landed. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher considered the possibility of negotiations, but it was mainly the British Foreign Secretary who was managing the situation, leaving Thatcher somewhat disengaged from the process. She was out of it. Let's take a moment to highlight the role of Lord Carrington from the British Foreign Secretary during this chaotic period. Carrington was not only a loyal ally to Prime Minister Thatcher, but also a significant figure in his own right, later serving as the Secretary General of NATO. He was among the first to recognize Thatcher's potential and formidable presence in British politics. There's a well-known anecdote that illustrates Carrington's support for Thatcher. During an interview with a journalist who questioned what would happen to the Conservative Party if Thatcher were to be removed from power, Carrington hesitated, indicating that there was no viable alternative to her leadership. When the journalist pressed further, asking, "What if a bus were to hit Mrs. Thatcher?" Carrington confidently replied, "The bus wouldn't have the courage to do that." So he really had faith in her. This moment underscores Carrington's faith in Thatcher's resilience and strength during a time when her leadership was under scrutiny. Lord Carrington, being a trusted ally of Margaret Thatcher, his instincts began to tell him that the situation with Argentina might take a more dangerous turn. The Foreign Office, under his leadership, had previously reassured the Prime Minister that negotiations could help avoid a conflict. However, by March 24th, Carrington was no longer certain. He sent a note to Thatcher expressing concern over Argentina's increasingly aggressive stance, particularly their inflammatory press coverage, which seemed to undermine any hopes for diplomacy. Carrington's note acknowledged the rising tensions and warned that the situation might escalate into a potential confrontation. What this meant was still unclear, but the Prime Minister was now on high alert. By this point, unknown to the British government, Argentine President Galtieri had already set in motion plans to invade the Falklands. On March 26, Galtieri ordered Operation Rosario. We're still talking about the 1982. Operation Rosario, the secret military invasion of the islands scheduled on April 2nd. While Britain was aware of the hostile tone of the Argentine media, they had no knowledge of the exact date of the invasion. The Foreign Office warnings came too late, as plans were already well underway. This illustrates the gaps in communication and intelligence that characterized the lead-up to the Falklands War. As tensions over the Falklands escalated, Margaret Thatcher recognized that diplomacy alone might not be enough to deter Argentina. Faced with mounting pressure, she took a decisive step on March 29, 1982. Realizing that negotiation might falter if Britain didn't demonstrate its readiness to defend the islands, Thatcher ordered a nuclear submarine to depart from Gibraltar and head for the Falklands. Although the submarine would take 2 weeks to arrive, the news of its deployment soon leaked to the press, and this was a development that Thatcher welcomed. In her memoirs, she later reflected on this moment, noting that her instinct told her it was time to send a strong message to Argentina, showing them that the British government was serious and prepared for military action if necessary. By making the deployment public, Thatcher aimed to convey that Britain was not willing to negotiate but also capable of defending its territory if needed. At a certain point, showing strength becomes necessary. Despite the reassurances from the Foreign Office and intelligence services, Margaret Thatcher felt uneasy as the situation escalated. This reflecting on this period in her memoirs. So, although her memoirs were, usually memoirs are often embellished, and Thatcher admits that she was indeed worried, that she was somehow worried about the situation. While everyone assured her that Argentina wouldn't invade, she remained skeptical, and she noted, "We knew they were unpredictable and unstable," leaving some ambiguity as whether she was referring to the dictatorship specifically or the Argentine leadership more broadly. Thatcher added, "I think none of us truly expected the invasion of the Falklands." Then things took a dramatic turn on the evening of March 31st. The British Secretary of State for Defense, John Nott, requested an urgent meeting with Thatcher, bringing key ministers to Downing Street. Nott carried vital information from American intelligence. The Argentine fleet was already at sea, loaded with troops and heading straight for the Falklands. This marked the definitive moment when British leadership realized the seriousness of the impending conflict. The meeting of March 31st, 1982 became a crucial turning point in the Falklands crisis. The Secretary of Defense presented a stark assessment warning Margaret Thatcher that if the Argentinians occupied the islands, it would be unthinkable to consider retaking them, he stated. We could never do it. This declaration alarmed Thatcher, who shot back, "How could we ever do it? It is entirely out of the question. We must retake them. If they land, don't come to me saying we can't do it." So she was pretty strong-willed. So she demanded to know the whereabouts of the military leadership, particularly the Chief of Naval Staff, Admiral Sir John Leach, who had yet to arrive. And this is a curious fact. So the reason why for Admiral Leach's absence soon became clear, because he's been detained while trying to navigate through Parliament in civilian clothes after being recognized by a member of Parliament. I don't think he was a very astute guy. Once he arrived, Thatcher inquired about the feasibility of organizing a mission to retake the islands. The Admiral quickly assessed the situation and assured her, "Of course, it can be done. I can send this aircraft carrier and that one, destroyers, frigates." Following this discussion, preparations to assemble the fleet began. While the Prime Minister could give the order, she clarified, "This isn't war. It's just gathering the fleet." That evening, Margaret Thatcher directed Admiral Sir John Leach to start assembling the fleet. While the cabinet would discuss the formal order for departure later, immediate action was necessary, with the Argentine landing set for April 2nd. There was only a day and a half left to intervene. The nuclear submarine had already departed, so they needed to consider alternative options. In the post-World War II context, there was only one plausible course of action: reach out to Big Brother, President Ronald Reagan. Thatcher sent an urgent telegram through a secure line explaining the gravity of the situation. The telegram read, "Dear Ron, you will be aware of the alarming information from our and your intelligence services that the Argentine Navy is preparing to invade the Falklands within 48 hours. Among other things, could you urgently speak to the Argentine president and ask him not to authorize any landing? Best regards, Margaret." This appeal highlighted the critical situation and the importance of U.S. support to prevent this conflict. With that, the United States entered the scene. President Ronald Reagan reached out to the Argentine leader Leopoldo Galtieri, but initially Galtieri was evasive and avoided calls. Eventually, Reagan insisted, and it became difficult for Galtieri to refuse a direct conversation with the President of the United States. The details of this exchange are notably captured in the diary of Gene Rentschler, one of Reagan's aides tasked with keeping the President informed about the unfolding situation in the Falklands. Rentschler documented his observation meticulously, knowing the significance of the events. As he noted in his diary, Galtieri eventually responded to Reagan's outreach, highlighting the pressure of the U.S. administration during this critical moment. Rentschler's diary continues to offer insights into the atmosphere of the time, and even including simple mundane things. Details such as an advertisement for the Bell Company, reflecting the mix of the serious political negotiations and the everyday world surrounding them. In Rentschler's diary, he notes a curious advertisement for the Bell Company that read, just reach out your hand. And at that moment, he was on the phone with President Reagan, who was trying to persuade Galtieri not to proceed with the invasion of the Falkland Islands. So Rentschler's account also shows Galtieri's position as a key collaborator of Reagan and as the strongman of Argentina. This illustrated the intricate web of international relations that were at play during a critical event. The phone call came just days before Argentina's planned invasion. Many might not have known about this behind-the-scenes diplomatic effort until recent discussions brought it to light, revealing the complexity of U.S.-Argentina relations in the Falkland crisis. Galtieri's shift from a celebrated ally to a controversial figure is striking, because just a year earlier, he was warmly welcomed in Washington and as a commendable general. But the dynamics changed dramatically as the Falklands crisis unfolded. During this phone call with President Reagan, Galtieri spoke in broken English, reminiscent of a mafioso. Again, his Italian ancestry was speaking there. So, from a crime drama, which painted him more as a bandit than a statesman. So Rentschler, who was present from the conversation, noted the contrast between Reagan's eloquence and Galtieri's clumsy speech. So he perceived that Galtieri's machismo would be an obstacle to a potential de-escalation. The Argentine leaders need to maintain faith with his countrymen, made it unlikely that he would back down from the planned invasion. It was more a matter of pride at that point. So this machismo suggested that Galtieri was willing to declare strength at all costs, further complicating diplomacy. Reagan was navigating a challenging situation during the Falkland crisis. While some of his aides pressed confusion over the significance of the islands, one remarked, I don't understand why they're fighting so much over that little cold pile of land down there. Reagan understood the gravity of the conflict. The Argentine government, led by Galtieri, believed their strong ties with the US would prevent American interventions and deter other nations from getting involved. But this was a miscalculation from his part, because we have serious consequences as the situation escalated, ultimately leading to a shift in US foreign policy that favored the British over the Argentines in the conflict. That evening, Reagan gathered with his advisors to discuss the crisis. Some voiced the opinion that the US should let the Argentines proceed, citing their friendship with the country. Among those present, though, there was Jean Kirkpatrick, the US ambassador to the UN, known for her controversial stance on dictatorships. So she was a person that she was famously distinguished between recoverable and unrecoverable regimes, asserting that while all dictatorships are problematic, leftist ones are beyond help, while right-wing dictatorships like Galtieri's could be worked with. This viewpoint influenced how the administration responded to the growing conflict in the Falklands. Now, Kirkpatrick argued for a hands-off approach, suggesting that the US should stay out of the conflict and let Argentina handle the situation. Interestingly, the day after this discussion, she was the guest of honor at a lunch hosted by the Argentine embassy. In contrast, Douglas Hankey, the Secretary of State, voiced a strong opposition to Kirkpatrick's view, insisting we cannot let them go ahead. Ultimately, Reagan sided with Hankey's perspective. He drafted a telegram to Margaret Thatcher that detailed his lengthy conversation with Galtieri regarding the Falkland situation. In the message, Reagan expressed his deep concern about a potential Argentine invasion, stating, I told him that starting military operation would compromise the offer of good offices, etc. He noted that while the general listened attentively, he left Reagan with the unmistakable impression that Argentina was already committed to armed conflict. Reagan concluded his telegram to Thatcher with a clear stance. While our policy on the issue of the Falkland sovereignty is neutrality, we will not be neutral if Argentina uses military force. Best wishes. This message signaled to Thatcher that the Argentines were unlikely to back down, and it reassured her that the US would not support them if they resorted to military action. So essentially, Argentina chose to use force. The Americans would stand with Britain. At this point, Thatcher convenes her government on the morning of April 2nd. The Argentines have already landed on the Falklands, although they're still unaware of it. A message from the ambassador has been lost in transit and never arrived. Later, a radio amateur in the Falklands intercepts a message that is then relayed to a British ship, ultimately informing London of the Argentines' occupation. As a result, the British government gathers in secrecy, fully recognizing that the crisis is now inevitable. What to do? Thatcher informs her ministers that she has already ordered the fleet to be redeployed and that is currently assembling. They must decide whether to let it sail. The government discusses various matters, including details for the fleet's command. On that Friday, April 2nd, the fleet will be led by the aircraft carrier Invincible, which has, guess who? Prince Andrew, the Queen's son, serving as an officer. A critical question arises. So, if the aircraft carrier sets sail for war, should Prince Andrew remain on board, or would it be better to keep him at home for safety? This leads to a discussion between Downing Street and Buckingham Palace. The Queen expresses her opinion that as long as Prince Andrew is on active duty with the Invincible, he should participate in the mission. After all, his grandfather, King George VI, fought in the Battle of Jutland, I think it's Jutland, making it unthinkable for a member of the royal family to be treated any differently from any other officers. With this concern resolved, Thatcher generally feels that there are no other problems to address. Well, at that time, I think Prince Andrew did not know a certain famous character that we all came to know him for later on. So that evening, the government decides that the fleet will depart in 2 days as soon as it is ready. Despite various concerns raised by the Foreign Office, Thatcher's frustration with the Foreign Office is apparent in her memoirs, where she notes their concerns reflected a lack of strong principles. They raised issues regarding the safety of British citizens in Argentina, difficulties in securing UN support, and uncertainties about backing from the European community and the US. And also, there were also fears of Soviet involvement and the risk of being seen as a colonial power. These concerns significantly influence her response to the Falklands crisis. While she admits that these concerns are valid, she emphasized that when at war, she says, one cannot allow difficulties to dominate one's thoughts. One must move forward with steely resolve. What alternative was there? Allowing a dictator, a mere puppet, to govern the Queen's subject through deception and violence? Not while I'm Prime Minister, she declares. Although this reflection comes after the fact, Thatcher's position is clear. As the Argentines have already landed, Reagan makes another attempt and calls Galtieri, who responds that England has refused to return the Falklands for 149 years, and now the time has run out. In England, it is crucial to remember that Thatcher is an unpopular prime minister, perceived as weak and likely to lose the upcoming elections. When newspapers published the news of the Argentine occupation on April 3rd, the sensation in England is one of national humiliation. The nation feels it has faced yet another disaster, leading to a shared sense of failure and a loss of pride. The press declares the Argentine occupation the worst humiliation for England since Suez. In 1956, the Suez Crisis occurred when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, a crucial route for British trade. In response, Britain, alongside France and Israel, launched a military intervention to seize the canal. However, the operation was met with significant international backlash, particularly from the United States, which pressured Britain to withdraw. This event marked a pivotal moment in British history, as it symbolized the decline of British status as a global superpower. Britain was in decline, while the United States was going up in notoriety in the world as a superpower. The British public perception shifted, realizing their country could no longer assert military power without American support, leading to a sense of national embarrassment and a reconsideration of their role on the world stage. On that April 3rd, 1982, British newspapers boldly proclaimed, "This is another Suez," signaling the gravity of the situation following the Argentine occupation of the Falklands Islands. That day, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher faced Parliament for an unprecedented Saturday session, a rare occurrence in British politics. The House of Commons was packed with MPs filling every available seat and many standing on the steps. They unusually gathered on This unusual gathering of Parliament reflected the gravity of the situation. As members took their seats, there was a palpable tension in the air. They knew they weren't just there for routine matters, they were preparing to face the unfolding national embarrassment, but brought on by the escalating conflict in the Falklands. A key feature of the British Parliament is that many MPs often vote based on personal beliefs rather than strictly following party lines, at least it was at the time. This leads to the formation of cross-party majorities on important issues, making it essential to persuade MPs, that members of parliament. In this context, impactful speeches are crucial. Thatcher rises to deliver one of her defining speeches, asserting to Parliament that the aggression faced has neither a shred of justification nor a grain of legality, calling for unity in condemnation. Thatcher took control of Parliament, though there was a tense moment where she nearly lost it. As she was about to criticize the Labour Party, she stated, "May I remind the honourable members of the opposition that they too, when they were in government," and the discussion was going on. At that point, a Labour MP interrupted, shouting, "We didn't lose the Falklands." The atmosphere in the House wavered briefly, but Thatcher quickly regained her composure and continued. In the end, Parliament voted to dispatch the fleet. The decision was made, Parliament had spoken, and the fleet was ready to set sail. In her memoirs, Thatcher admits that she was terrified during the vote, as the majority was not as strong as it seemed. Many MPs thought sending the fleet would scare the Argentines and lead to negotiations. Only a few, she recalls, were truly ready to go all out to war. On April 3rd, during a tense session in the House of Commons, Enoch Powell delivered a powerful speech that challenged Margaret Thatcher's resolve. Known for his sharp independence and nationalistic views, Powell spoke with his characteristic seriousness, directly addressing Thatcher and putting her leadership to the test in the face of national crisis. In his speech, Powell referenced the nickname Iron Lady that Thatcher had earned from the Soviets early in her premiership, acknowledging that it symbolized her strong stance against communism. However, he then turned the focus on to the immediate crisis, stating, "In the next week or two, this House, the nation, and the Honorable Lady herself will find out of what metal she is truly made." His words questioned whether Thatcher had the resilience to stand firm in the face of the Falklands crisis, and implicitly dared her to live up to her reputation. The speech is often remembered as a defining moment, not only in terms of foreign policy, but also in maintaining the confidence of the Parliament. When Thatcher left Parliament that day, with the weight of Powell's challenge and the clear expectation to prove her determination in the coming days. However, she had an important advantage. She was more in tune with the sentiments of the British public than with Parliament or even her own Foreign Office. The public mood was resolute. Polls showed that 80% of the British population believed retaking the Falklands was necessary. When asked whether this should be done through peaceful negotiations or by force, the majority sided with force. Thatcher knew that she had the backing of the people, and with this confidence, the decision was made: the fleet would sail. As discussions intensified, some MPs began to question whether Britain should formally declare war. During this time, remarkable records emerged, including handwritten notes from Conservative MPs detailing their debates. These notes contained passionate contributions like Lord Onslow's bold proposal to sink their entire fleet. However, there were growing concerns among some MPs. One remarked, "The people are concerned about what's happened, and we mustn't appear weak." This sentiment reflected anxiety over how the British public perceived their government's response. And at the same time, the Foreign Office was accused of smelling like appeasement. This is a big word. This reference to Chamberlain's policy in the late 1930s, when Britain sought to pacify Hitler through concessions, had become a politically toxic term, appeasement. Now, this symbolized a weakness in the face of aggression, something Thatcher and her supporters were determined to avoid. In 1982, there were voices within the British government warning that the Foreign Office's insistence on negotiations with Argentina was dangerous and smelled of appeasement. Some MPs, recalling the policy of concessions to Hitler before World War II, were concerned that hesitation might lead to a loss of British control over the Falklands. Despite this, most MPs believed that the country was already at war. Foreign Secretary Lord Peter Carrington argued that there was no obligation to declare war, citing the legal complexities involved, which required consultations with lawyers. However, this explanation concealed the government's belief that a formal declaration of war was unnecessary and could complicate matters further. Carrington suggested that times had changed, unlike in 1914 or even 1939, when formal declarations of war were common, even if they were laden with propaganda, such measures were now viewed as outdated and even impractical. So his position was officially supported by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, reinforcing the government's stance against a formal declaration of war. In an interview on April 5, 1982, Prime Minister Thatcher was asked whether Britain was truly preparing for war with Argentina. She acknowledged the goal was to recover in the Falkland Islands, stating, "We must do what is necessary to achieve this," while insisting that she wouldn't describe it in terms of war. So Thatcher highlighted that a formal declaration of war was technically different and deemed unnecessary. She advised against focusing on technicalities, kind of diverting the theme here, emphasizing that the government was aware of what needed to be done and that there were various ways to achieve it, adding, "We hope we haven't chosen the worst one." Thatcher's words reflected her belief that confronting dictators was always risky, but the risks of not doing so were even greater. So, drawing from her own experiences during World War II, she viewed the lessons of her generation, especially the consequences of appeasing Hitler, as vital for understanding the current situation in 1982. Well, even if it was more than 40 years earlier, I believe, from Hitler's times. So she believed that Britain could not afford to back down in the face of aggression, and the caution exhibited by the Foreign Office reminded her of the mistakes made in Munich in 1938. On April 5th of 1982, Lord Carrington resigned as Foreign Secretary, stating that it was his ministry's responsibility to manage the crisis and that he had failed. Feeling it was a matter of personal honor, he stepped down, despite being a close friend and loyal ally of the Prime Minister, of the Thatcher. And political pressure dictated this decision. When asked about Carrington's resignation, Thatcher expressed regret, calling it a significant loss. "It was a great blow to me, and I was very sorry for him. He was a valuable part of my government." She acknowledged Carrington's sense of personal responsibility for the crisis mishandling and praised his honor in resigning, stating, "It's quite wonderful to have people in politics who feel so strongly about honor. They step down when the moment comes." After Carrington's resignation, Thatcher maintained her commitment to sending the fleet to the Falklands. During the following month, the United States attempted to mediate between Britain and Argentina, urging both parties to de-escalate their military actions. However, both nations remained resolute and unwilling to compromise. In Argentina, a war mentality had taken root well before the British landing. Morale was deteriorating, and despite claims from the press that "we are ready, we are waiting for them," panic was spreading among the upper echelons of society. A secret U.S. intelligence report captured a significant conversation with a high-ranking Argentine politician, a backer of the military junta, who confided, "It's do or die now. If we keep the Falklands, great. If not, Galtieri will fall. This politician highlighted a grim reality. Negotiating at this stage would be more damaging than losing the war, as it would lead to Galtieri's immediate ousting. He suggested that losing the conflict might even be preferable, underscoring a widespread belief among Argentine officials that the invasion had been a monumental failure. There was a broad consensus that the president and his advisors were incompetent, signaling a critical shift in the nation's confidence. The Argentine politician expressed a deep sense of disillusionment during this conversation, with the American lamenting that at 41 years old, he had come to realize he would never witness a serious Argentina in his lifetime. He elaborated that by serious, he meant a stable, democratic, and prosperous country. This sentiment resonated with the American, who found it hard to grasp initially. The politician further explains that perhaps his children might see a serious Argentina, but he had resigned himself to the belief that he would not. The war concluded swiftly, in the British achieving a decisive victory at a tragic cost. 1,000 lives were lost, including 649 Argentines, 258 British, and 3 Falkland civilians. Notably, the conflict was never formally declared, which meant there was no requirement for a peace treaty. Nevertheless, the aftermath was significant. On June 14, 1982, the Argentine flag was lowered at Port Stanley, signaling the surrender of the last Argentine troops. Just days later, on June 18, General Leopoldo Galtieri resigned from the presidency. Although another general took his place, the military dictatorship proved unable to maintain control. The political climate deteriorated to such an extent that the junta was compelled to call for free elections, leading to the elections of Raúl Alfonsín as president and marking the end of the military regime. I'm pretty sure there was maybe the involvement of the United States Secret Services at that point to have a shift from a military dictatorship into somehow a sort of more liberal and modern elections. Leopoldo Galtieri's downfall following the Falklands War mirrored the broader collapse of Argentina's military junta. After the British victory, Galtieri was removed from power and in subsequent years faced legal consequences for human rights violations. And from 1986 to 1991, he was imprisoned. He was later pardoned under a controversial law that extended clemency for military figures from Argentina's dictatorship era. In 2002, the legal charges related to the dictatorship's abuses led to another trial, though Galtieri died from a heart attack while under house arrest in 2003. His legacy was marked by condemnation, and once again, The Economist obituary, as I mentioned earlier, emphasized that while some Argentines might forgive his ruthlessness, his failure in the Falklands reflected unforgivable incompetence. For Margaret Thatcher, the Falklands War was a pivotal moment that reshaped her political fortunes. Before the war, she faced significant unpopularity domestically, but the successful recapture of the Falklands gave a boost to her image as a decisive leader. The victory in 1982 proved a turning point, leading to her overwhelming victory in 1983 general elections. It gave her the political momentum to implement her economic and social policies, which transformed the UK's political landscape. Thatcher's post-war leadership cemented her reputation, making her one of the most dominant British political figures of the 20th century. So we come back to Enoch Powell's remarks about Margaret Thatcher that became a famous part of her story during the Falklands War. So before the war, he had doubted whether she could live up to her Iron Lady nickname, famously saying, "In the coming weeks, the country will see what metal the Prime Minister is made of." After Britain's victory in the war, Powell returned to Parliament and reversed his earlier skepticism with a clever remark. He said that after analyzing the substance in questions, It turned out to be iron of the highest quality, signaling Thatcher's proven strength and leadership. This moment solidified her image as the Iron Lady and established her political transformation in the eyes of the public. In the aftermath of the war, Thatcher herself reflected on the national response. In a speech, she remarked that what excited people most wasn't the usual domestic issues like inflation or housing, but the chance to serve a great cause, the cause of liberty. This was her way of framing the Falklands War not just as a military victory, but as a moral one. Some might say that what truly thrilled people was the experience of going to war, but Thatcher presented it as defending freedom, which made her point hard to argue against. This marked a turning point for Thatcher. Her strong relationship during the Falklands War turned her into a political figure that people either admired or feared, but no one could deny her impact on the country. Her words and actions during the crisis solidified her as a force to be reckoned with, whether people liked it or not. Well, what do you think about this incredible story? This is part of our recent history. So once you have documents that are declassified, you can really go through and see if they still don't have other black marked areas where you cannot see. But to this extent, we pretty much found out the ins and outs of what really happened. And well, to go back to the modern day, what do you think? Are there going to be escalations, military escalations, you think, between the British and the Argentine government once again with Javier Milei? I think they're resentful, the Argentines, of course, because for them to make a proposal, but at the same time, the Chagos Islands given to Mauritius opened a precedent and which the Argentinians hope that it could work in their favor. However, knowing geopolitics, a land that is as far as so distant as much as the Falklands compared, if you look on the map, you could see they're a world away. So there's no really way they could enforce that, hold that territory, but it's a reminder of the colonial power that the British used to have in the 16th and 17th century, 18th century as well. So they've been a global superpower that pretty much dominated over the world with different trades. And soon they pretty much, the places that they colonized found their own independence, and the British gave those places up to self-govern in their own way. So do you think this is a new modern way to do things, to abandon colonization in favor of freedom and creating a nation, a new country to that point? Well, I think there is still the issue, geopolitics, there is the issue of natural resources, because a country as small as the British, they might still need, they still have territories around the world, and they may need natural resources from that is going to add to their economy and their influence in the world. If they would go, well, they will be without, and they would have less, in a world in which resources are scarce. So what do you suppose they should do? But at the same time, it's a matter of national pride from both country. One thing that struck me the most about the story is that the Thatcher pretty much changed the words. Even if the Argentinians were the aggressors at that point, the response, the change of words, there was no declaration of war. So this marked a new era, which we are reminiscent today. Their wars are no more declared. There's no need to declare wars. We just call them military aid or stabilization missions. I don't know how much you want to call them, but they just changed the names, and she mentioned that it was not war. For them, it was a matter of liberty. So you see how you can change a term and make it sound different in order to make a certain action more acceptable. So that's the only thing. War is war in the end, and a crime is a crime, as Margaret Thatcher stated in her memoirs. But we can just leave it here, and I'll just leave you draw your own conclusions, because you need to be free thinkers as always. And this will be it for today, and I hope you enjoyed it. As always, subscribe, like, and share, and I will see you next time. Bye.